from this research with Jewish museums in Europe, including the Manchester Jewish Museum, who we will co-present with just next month. So I'll jump right in. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you about my research on rethinking Nazi-era looted art restitution and the agency of Jewish actors in particular. So these I call Jewish cultural brokers. Many of the people I interviewed are actually Jewish lawyers, but also archivists, researchers, individuals who work in the art history and art world more broadly. And I've undertaken about now 15 interviews with such individuals, and I will draw from that. So I'll start with this quite famous painting, an image of the woman in gold, which is a Gustav Klimt painting of Adele Bloch-Bauer from Vienna, and it's become a kind of symbol of restitution. The not so smooth recovery of this painting, which happened in 2006, occurred through the actions of the last surviving heir of the Bloch-Bauer family. Her name was Maria Altmann. She was a California resident, and this was documented by journalists across the world, and also in a Hollywood movie that starred Helen Mirren by the very same name. So the reason I start this talk with an image of the woman in gold is because this painting is really an emblem for the restitution of Nazi-era looted art. It transcends a family story to become this widely recognizable material representation of this process. But it is also an example that showcases the transnationality of restitution, which will come up quite a bit in this presentation. And it's no longer a physical terrain only, so not only a material terrain in terms of returning actual items that are themselves materials, but also a moral terrain that regards the acts of return and repair for the descendants of Holocaust survivors and victims. So most research on restitution has been carried out in the areas of history, art history, and also law. In these disciplines, scholars tend to focus on the objects themselves of restitution, not so much on the subjects who undertake the restitution work. So my research and research I'm collaborating with Dr. Everett on turns towards this agency of Jewish cultural brokers in this terrain. As I was saying earlier, lawyers, archivists, researchers, those who work in the art world, also documentarians. The individuals that I interviewed in this area, these contemporary cultural brokers, are also often the children and in a few cases, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So it wasn't that I selected people based on this, but this ended up being in the majority of the cases true. Now, together in the story I'll tell you today, these Jewish cultural brokers of restitution demonstrate a generational shift from Jewish victimhood to agency, a shift from historical erasure to historical representation, and also from a framework of human condemnation to one of redemption, in this kind of transnational moral narrative that has real material effects. So for example, restitution positions have been created at major cultural institutions, including museums, like in my home city, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and in art auction houses like Christie's, for instance, or Sotheby's. All use what a lot of my interlocutors, as I interviewed, termed civil realms to redress an uncivil past. See if I can switch the. So in this research, I shed light on the role of the second generation, so to say, or the next generation. So these are Jews.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure when you're clicking through, the slides are syncing with ours. So if you just let me know next slide, I'm happy to click. Sure. Are we still on the painting?
No, so it should be one that says the next generation. It should be the one after the painting.
Perfect, sorry.
So I can just tell you to click through then instead of clicking. Sorry. So what this shows essentially is this next generation who've shaped this kind of transnational sphere of work, essentially. And one of my interlocutors, I call Sarah, who's a restitution lawyer in Paris, spoke extensively about how it wasn't just the Washington Conference, which essentially was the first set of non-binding principles to encourage restitution in 1998, but that there was a whole movement behind restitution efforts in this next generation, or because of this next generation. So this quote unquote next generation has been involved in monitoring those principles, as well as actual changes to laws and policies. I don't have time to go into all the details today, but usually that's through complex legal cases that they instigate our lawyers in. So they are engaged with as lawyers, as claimants, as well as researchers. And so in this way, they've been involved not just in the kind of moral terrain, but also the legal terrain. And I believe from my research that these subjects, this next generation, is key to transforming the trauma and suffering of their forebears into meaningful action that gives shape to this transnational sphere, and one that has potential effects not only for the restitution of Nazi-era looted art, but also colonial looted art and artifacts. In examining their roles in the restitution process in the next few moments, I'll also illuminate the increasing value of restitution in not economic terms, but instead these cultural moral terms, which transcend the boundaries of any nation state. So if we can go to the next slide again. The following slide. Do you see the images of the paintings? Okay, so in the next, because I can't see when you change it, and I think you can't see when I change it. This is the woman in gold again, and you see the image of Maria Altmann. And this case was brought by Randy Schoenberg, who is a prominent Jewish lawyer. He's also the grandson of the celebrated composer Arnold Schoenberg from Vienna, who fled in 1933 because he was Jewish. And what I learned is it wasn't just Randy working alone, but actually a kind of collective or group of these next generation restitution workers from many fields, not least of all, as I believe you'll see in, or I think you see it in the next slide, but if not least of all, Ronald Lauder, who is this kind of major figure in the restitution field and has his own gallery in New York, where he houses works, including many major high-profile restituted works from Austria and Germany. So there has been this kind of turn towards the high symbolic value of these objects. And that's what you see on the following slide, if you don't mind going forward. That's just the woman in gold was essentially, once it was restituted, it was auctioned off, and Ronald Lauder purchased it way above the economic value. So he purchased it at a far higher price than what it is actually valued at. He said this was a symbolic move to show to sort of try to match the moral value of bringing this restituted piece into the public as a restituted piece. And it's demarcated that way if you visit this institution in New York. It's a small gallery in New York. Now, if you can go to the next slide, I want to zoom out a bit to this generational experience, because we all know that the Holocaust entailed a loss of home, a loss of language, a loss of place, of orientation entirely in the world, and that this rupture had severe consequences. Now, many of the restitution cultural brokers that I spoke with spoke about their parents or grandparents and their own trauma and the kind of darkness they felt that they were swallowed into. The most powerful quotation about this I want to share with you is from Ned, who is a restitution lawyer in New York City. His father had fled from Germany to the US, and he kept describing him as a deeply Jewish but not a pious man who would attend synagogue on high holidays like Yom Kippur. And each year, he listened to the rabbi in their community in Queens and New York tell the story of Jonah and the whale. Now, according to Ned, his father basically had the perspective that, and he said this to Ned one year, that the rabbi was getting it wrong. The way he was describing Jonah and the whale and the way he was interpreting it was incorrect. According to his father, it's not about Jonah, it's about the whale. And what Ned said to me was that was his father's perspective, that each day you're swallowed into darkness and then spit out to begin the next again. And I think these kind of dark and traumatic experiences were shared across the parents and grandparents of these cultural brokers. A lot of their focus in our interviews as well was how they could overcome their parents' paralysis. And a kind of beautiful quotation again from Ned was, if you don't mind going to the next, sorry, it's not on the next slide, was how could our parents' paralysis be overcome? could we somehow speak for the silence? So a lot of the kind of literature on the generation that was persecuted by the Nazis is that they felt silenced. Those who survived felt silenced afterwards. Sometimes it was a literal loss of language again, but it was also the sense that they did not want to or were not able to speak about what happened. The majority of the cultural brokers I interviewed talked about breaking through this silence through their work and bringing a kind of public attention to the work of restitution. So this kind of entailed for individuals like Ned and others the sense of recovering pieces of a silence and lost history, a material object or many material objects that represent an act of recovery in which they can actively partake. And I think this is really important for, as I begin on the next slide, the idea of agency. Most of my research in this area really does focus on agency and the idea that individuals, families, or individuals themselves can be victims, but that victimhood is not a totalizing experience, and that there also is agency even when there are significant social constraints. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, which has the heading history, one of the main themes that has come up so far in my research on this is how in kind of the recovery of works, history is recovered, history of individuals, of families, and a reweaving into a larger history from which people were erased literally, and in which there was an attempt to erase Jewry in its entirety. So Evelyn is one of the women that I interviewed for this project, and she runs a restitution organization in the UK, and her work has really centered on, well, essentially bringing back objects for people to feel that the histories of their families are more full or fulfilled, restoring and not just restoring material pieces, but as she says, restoring people and families to the historical record. When I met her, she was really frenetic. She was constantly moving. She told me that she was pulled by the feeling that each case matters vitally in turning the tides of history, and she's constantly getting cases assigned to her for research, for helping in recovery. Also, she works greatly in mediation with museums, and I'll turn to museums at the end of this talk, and specifically with art museums. So she's one of the major negotiators over pieces where it's legally unclear if they have to be restituted, but morally clear that they should be restituted. And that is often, that I would say is the majority of pieces. She described this kind of landscape in this work in which the starting point is often for public and private collections to hold on to art because the legal framework allows them to. But she, of course, is concerned more with these moral, ethical frameworks that transcend not only the legal framework, but also national boundaries again. And she talked about this kind of family history and its relationship to global history. And that's the quote I've shared with you, which is that every single case that we have, we're writing the history of that family. It's about obviously restoring the family to the historical record, whether it's the restitution object is a book or a painting. They are writing the story of a family who are erased from history. And there may be a record that they're abroad, or a record that they were murdered, or a record that they fled, but often there's no trace. And actually these individual items become the only trace of those histories. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide, which is kind of my conclusion on the work that I've been doing. And then I want to speak for a moment about the future work that builds on this. As I had earlier told you, Ned, a restitution lawyer in New York, begun our interview with the biblical story of Jonah and the whale and his father's interpretation of being swallowed into darkness each day. This was nested within a larger story of his father's struggle to break free of the suffering that silenced him and many in his generation, and that transformed generations like his own that followed into seekers of the past in search of memories and artifacts. For Ned, born into this kind of silenced generation of his father, the story of Jonah and the whale is not about getting lost in darkness, he says, but rather redemption through collective atonement, that we face our sins and find the light. What he learned was the tragedy of the story, that Jonah could not find his way back from sin, and he could not understand the need to atone for his sins that were not his alone, but collective sins. So essentially for Ned, in his work on restitution, it's not about condemnation or guilt. it's actually all about atonement. And he ended our interview very poetically on turning back to the Yom Kippur service and what this means to him and what this means in terms of his work. So he says that in the Yom Kippur service, there is a point at which we stop saying, forgive me. We're asking God, forgive us. The understanding is that we are not only asking forgiveness for something that we as individuals have done. We want the strength to recognize that there are sins and not to repeat them. Redemption is in atonement. And so this atonement is collective. It's beyond the individual, beyond the Jewish collective as well, beyond the individual state. It's a kind of transnational and transcultural act of repairing civility and creating inclusion in the world in which we live now. So if you go to the next slide, essentially the shift I've tried to make, I'm a sociologist. I don't even remember if I said this at the beginning, but I'm a cultural sociologist, so my work kind of sits at the intersection of culture and sociology. And the shift I've tried to make in this work is how we value and revalue restituted art and artifacts. What I learned from my interlocutors in this research, this ongoing research, are these shifts, again, from victimhood to agency, from silence to giving voice to history, from condemnation of perpetrators to redemption through collective acts of atonement, and from the national to the transnational. So thinking about how artworks and affected parties, often scattered across the globe, might come together and might intersect with one another. Much of the work, again, occurs on this transnational level, and it occurs in this legally gray realm in which people are not necessarily required or institutions to restitute work, but there is a moral imperative when the histories can be traced. And I won't talk, I guess, deeply about what it means to restitute, but if you turn to the next slide, and I would like to draw attention to museums, and the idea that the goal is not to quote unquote strip the walls, as Evelyn said to me. The objective is not always to take artworks out of museums. Sometimes the objective is just the recognition that it has belonged to a certain individual or family, and that is made public. Sometimes it is just a conversation between the institution and an individual or a family about what should happen with the artwork. And most of the time, artworks remain in museums or are transferred to other museums or collections. So it's not actually the reality that most people want to have, these, especially like these high value artworks in their homes where they will deteriorate without the proper conditions to take care of them. So the final slide, which shifts a little bit towards the future, and I think some of our collaborations in the future are really the role of museums. And part of this relates to a project I'm working on now on unprovenance objects. Most objects are not the woman in gold. They're not famous objects. They're not high value objects. They actually are candlesticks, or they're a book that your parent owned or your grandparents owned. And most of those types of objects are actually housed in Jewish museums. So I would like to, as I go forward, collaborate with museums and how they explore and express the provenance of objects, as well as restitution processes when they do happen, but also engage with them actively as actors and agents in this process as well. Not just art museums, which are really at the center of our discussions and deliberations, and should continue to be so, but also Jewish museums and Holocaust museums, which have the majority of objects from the period, and also have the vast majority of these unprovenance objects without clear traceable histories, but that we know come from that particular period and have been rooted. So part of my goal is to turn towards how we think of unprovenance objects as cultural heritage, and to continue to emphasize the agency of Jewish actors in this field, as well as Jewish collective actors like museums and institutions, cultural institutions that serve the public at large. So I will cut it off there. And I look forward to any conversation and discussion after the next one. Thank you. And thanks.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And we'll hand to Stacey, and then we'll take questions and discussion of the two papers together. And just to reassure you, and Ellie did a fantastic job with the slides, so we were following them in the order.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And am I okay to